My name is Matthew. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where being reliable mattered more than being visible. I'm the kind of person people describe as steady, low maintenance, and easy to work with. Not flashy, not loud. The kind of guy managers feel comfortable leaning on, because I don't push back much, and I don't complain. At least, that's how I used to be seen. I've always believed that if you did your job well, consistently, and with integrity, things would eventually line up. Promotions, recognition, trust. I wasn't naive enough to think it would be fast, but I believed it would be fair. I worked 70-hour weeks for a promotion. I didn't exaggerate that number. I tracked the hours, nights, weekends, holidays. When things broke, I was the one who fixed them. When no one wanted to stay late, I stayed. And when the promotion finally opened, they gave it to the boss's nephew. What made it harder wasn't just the decision, it was the way it was delivered. My performance review was excellent. Those were the exact words, but the decision was already made long before I walked into that room. The review wasn't a discussion, it was a formality. This isn't a story about revenge. There's no shouting match, no dramatic exit, no public humiliation. What I want to share is quieter than that, and I think more honest. It's about how people are slowly assigned roles without ever being told, about how silence is often mistaken for weakness, and about what happens when someone stops trying to be seen and instead starts paying attention. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through what it felt like to be invisible without realizing it, how small dismissals add up, how I rationalized things that didn't sit right, and how one ordinary moment, nothing explosive, shifted something internal that never went back to the way it was. There's no villain monologue here, no miracle turnaround, just decisions, documentation, timing, and the quiet kind of dominance that doesn't announce itself until it's already too late to stop. I'm telling this story not to ask for sympathy, and not to paint myself as flawless. I made compromises. I stayed quiet when I shouldn't have. I accepted praise instead of clarity. But I'm telling it honestly, because I know I'm not the only one who's been told they're doing great while being kept exactly where they are. Before we go further, have you ever looked back at a moment and realized the outcome had already been decided, no matter how well you performed? For a long time, I didn't think of myself as invisible. I thought of myself as reliable. That was the word people used most often. Matthew's solid. Matthew gets things done. If you need someone to stay late, call Matthew. If a client is upset, put Matthew on it. He'll smooth it over. It sounded like trust. It felt like trust, and for years I wore it like a badge. In meetings, I was usually the one sitting slightly back from the table, laptop open, taking notes. Not because anyone asked me to, but because no one else did. When discussions drifted into vague territory, I'd quietly clarify the numbers, the timelines, the risks. People would nod. Sometimes they'd say, "Good point." Then they'd move on. I wasn't the person interrupted. I also wasn't the person built on. My contributions landed, settled, and disappeared into the floor like weight added to a foundation no one planned to admire. To my managers, I was low risk. I didn't have sharp edges. I didn't posture. I didn't talk about ambition in loud, confident sentences. When asked where I saw myself in 5 years, I gave honest, careful answers. Growing here. Taking on more responsibility. Adding value where it makes sense. I thought humility was a strength. I didn't realize how easily it could be mistaken for acceptance. When deadlines stacked up, I absorbed them. When roles blurred, I filled the gaps. I learned systems no one wanted to learn. I documented processes no one asked to see. I became the person people depended on without ever needing to acknowledge it. There's a strange comfort in that role. You're needed. You're busy. You're praised in passing. But you're also never considered. Not for stretch roles, not for visibility, not for leadership in the room, only leadership behind the scenes. I remember one offhand comment from a director during a quarterly review. He smiled, glanced at my numbers, and said, "Matthew's always steady. We don't have to worry about him." Everyone laughed lightly. I smiled too. I didn't hear the other half of that sentence until much later, because he won't go anywhere. The newer hires came in louder, more confident. They spoke about impact, growth, and leadership within their first 6 months. Some of them were talented, some of them were just visible, but all of them were discussed. I wasn't. When restructuring conversations happened, my name never came up. Not as a risk, not as an opportunity. I was assumed, like electricity, useful, essential, but not part of the design conversation. I told myself that was fine. I told myself I didn't need to be flashy. Those results spoke for themselves, that the right people noticed. What I didn't admit was how often decisions seemed to happen around me, not with me. How often have I found out about changes after they were finalized? How often my workload increased without my authority changing at all? I wasn't mistreated. That's important. No one yelled at me, no one belittled me. In fact, people were polite, appreciative even. But appreciation without progression is a kind of stall, and stalls are quiet. You don't feel the engine stop. You just notice you're not moving anymore. At home, friends would ask how work was going. I'd say, busy, but good. Because it was. And because admitting anything else felt ungrateful. I didn't think of myself as someone being overlooked. I thought of myself as someone being patient. That distinction mattered, to me and to them. Because patience, when misunderstood, turns into permission. And by the time I realized how clearly my role had been defined in other people's minds, it had already hardened into expectation. Matthew will handle it. Matthew won't complain. Matthew doesn't need anything. Matthew is fine. The first time I noticed something was off, it didn't feel important enough to name. It was small. Almost nothing. The kind of thing you'd hesitate to bring up because you'd sound petty if you did. We had just finished a major internal project. 3 months of process cleanup, vendor renegotiations, and system migration. I had been the one coordinating between departments, translating technical constraints into timelines executives could understand. I stayed late more nights than I could count. I knew every weak point in the rollout because I'd personally patched most of them. At the wrap-up meeting, the department head thanked the team. Names were mentioned, jokes were made. Applause happened in that polite corporate way that doesn't quite reach the eyes. My name didn't come up, not because the work wasn't noticed. I could see my language in the summary slides, my frameworks, my risk notes, almost word for word. But credit had a way of floating upward, diffusing into titles instead of people. I remember feeling a brief, sharp confusion, like reaching for a step you expect to be there and finding air instead. Then I corrected myself. It's fine, I thought. They know what I did. This is just how it works. Later that afternoon, my manager stopped by my desk. He smiled, relaxed, almost cheerful. Great work on the project, he said. Couldn't have done it without you. I thanked him. Meant it. That should have been enough. But something about the timing stuck with me. Praise delivered privately, after public silence. Appreciation that asked for nothing in return, and offered nothing forward. That night, I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. No emotion, just a fact. Project closed. No formal recognition. I didn't know why I wrote it down. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't angry. It just felt unfinished. The next small cut came a few weeks later. A meeting invite went out for a planning session directly tied to my area of responsibility. I wasn't included. I found out because someone forwarded me the notes afterward, asking me to sense-check the decisions. I stared at the email longer than I needed to. Again, I rationalized. Probably an oversight. They know I'll weigh in later. And I did. I sent back thoughtful feedback, flagged 2 risks, offered alternatives. The final plan incorporated most of my suggestions. No one acknowledged the source. These moments didn't hurt the way obvious disrespect does. They didn't trigger anger. They triggered doubt. Was I imagining a pattern where there wasn't one? Was this just how mature professionals operated? Less ego, more execution? Everyone else seemed fine with it, or maybe they were just better at pretending. I tested the waters once, casually. During a one-on-one, I mentioned that I'd like to be looped into earlier discussions, given how closely they are tied to my work. My manager nodded. That makes sense, he said. We'll try to do better. He sounded sincere, and for a while nothing changed. The thing about the first cut isn't the pain. It's the permission it gives others, and yourself, to keep going as if nothing happened. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, that you're above it, that focusing on recognition is ego-driven. You convince yourself that consistency will win out over time. But consistency without boundaries slowly teaches people what they can take for free. I didn't become cynical. I became quieter. I started noticing how often decisions were announced rather than discussed. How often was my role to implement, not shape. How often my workload grew in direct proportion to my silence. Still, I stayed, I worked, I delivered. Because leaving felt dramatic, and staying felt responsible. And because deep down, I still believed that someone, somewhere, was keeping score fairly. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar. But it marked the moment I started paying attention. Once you decide something isn't a problem, your mind gets very good at protecting that decision. I didn't wake up one day and think, I'm being dismissed. Instead, I built explanations, reasonable ones. The kind that made me feel mature, professional, above the noise. They're busy. It's not personal. They trust me. That's why they don't micromanage. Each explanation softened the edges of what was happening, and each one made it easier for the next thing to slide by without friction. Over time, patterns emerged, not loudly but consistently. Meetings where I was invited only if there was a problem to solve. Planning sessions where my role was to react rather than contribute. Emails that CC'd me after decisions were locked, with language like looping Matthew in for execution. Execution, not a strategy, not ownership. I noticed how often I was asked to clean up ambiguity created by other people's confidence. Someone would promise a deadline without understanding the constraints, and I'd be pulled in afterward to make it possible. Or at least less embarrassing when it wasn't. And I did it. Quietly. Efficiently. I took pride in being the one who could absorb chaos and turn it into order. What I didn't notice at first was how this reliability became my ceiling. When new initiatives were announced, leadership roles were assigned quickly. Names floated around, people who talked well in meetings, who framed ideas as vision instead of labor. I wasn't resentful. I told myself they were better suited for it. More natural leaders. Meanwhile, I became the person they checked with after those leaders spoke, just to make sure reality wouldn't contradict the story. There was a moment that stands out now. We were in a cross-functional meeting, discussing a timeline that I knew was unrealistic. I explained why, calmly, clearly with data. The room went quiet. Then someone else, more senior, rephrased my point in broader terms. Heads nodded. The timeline was adjusted. Afterward, a colleague leaned over and said, "Good save." I smiled, said nothing. That's when I realized something unsettling. People weren't ignoring me. They were using me, selectively, efficiently, without needing to acknowledge. And I was helping them do it. I told myself I was being a team player, that ego didn't matter, that my work spoke for itself. But work doesn't speak. People do. And I wasn't speaking. Every time I chose not to push back, not to ask why I wasn't included, not to claim ownership, I was teaching everyone, including myself, that my role was support, not leadership. The disrespect wasn't loud. It was procedural. It lived in calendars, in phrasing, in who was asked to present versus who was asked to prepare slides. It lived in the assumption that I'd handle things without needing context or credit. I normalized it by calling it professionalism. I even defended it when friends questioned me. It's just how things are, I'd say. I don't need the spotlight. But there's a difference between not needing the spotlight and being kept in the dark. By the time I noticed how rarely my growth was discussed, how performance conversations focused on output but never trajectory, I had already internalized the idea that asking for more would be disruptive. So I didn't ask. I worked harder, took on more, became indispensable in the narrowest sense of the word. And that's the trap. Indispensability without authority doesn't elevate you. It anchors you. I didn't feel angry. I felt contained, like my professional identity had been quietly shrink-wrapped around usefulness. Looking back, this was the phase where I mistook endurance for virtue. I thought staying quiet was a strength. I didn't yet understand that silence, once normalized, stops being invisible and starts being expected. It wasn't assigned in a meeting. No one sat me down and explained it. There was no memo, no title change, no formal acknowledgement. The role I was given emerged the way habits do, slowly, through repetition, until it felt like it had always been that way. I was the reliable one, the safe pair of hands, the person who would make it work no matter how unclear the request or how unrealistic the timeline. If something needed judgment without visibility, it came to me. If something needed to be explained without friction, I handled it. And if something went wrong, I was close enough to fix it, but far enough from the decision that no one expected me to question it. That was my lane. I noticed it in how people spoke around me. Matthew will take care of it. Not can, will. Certainty without consultation. Trust without agency. When new initiatives came up, I was often introduced as support. Matthew's been helping us think through the details. Helping, never leading. At first, I told myself this was temporary, that once things stabilized, there would be room to reassess, that my consistency was building a case I didn't need to argue out loud. But stability never came. There was always another urgent project, another transition, another reason to defer conversations about growth. The more competent I became, the narrower my role felt. I trained new hires who would later present work I'd guided behind the scenes. I briefed managers who would summarize my analysis in executive language. I watched people with less context but more visibility step into roles I'd been quietly preparing them for. And still, no one was cruel. That's what made it so difficult to name. No one excluded me with malice. They excluded me with habit. The role I was assigned required emotional neutrality. I couldn't be frustrated because I was the calm one. I couldn't be ambitious because I was the stabilizer. I couldn't disrupt because disruption would contradict the very reliability people depended on. I started to sense the boundaries of what I was allowed to be. When I spoke confidently, it was accepted, but not amplified. When I offered ideas, they were welcomed, but reframed by others. When I stayed late, it was expected. When I left on time, it was noticed. There was an unspoken agreement in the air. I would keep things running smoothly, and in return, I would be spared scrutiny. No pressure, no spotlight, no real advancement. It was comfortable. That was the problem. Comfort can look like respect if you don't look too closely. I remember overhearing a conversation once, completely unintentional. Two managers are discussing staffing for a new initiative. "Who should we put on this?" one asked. "Not Matthew," the other replied, without hesitation. "We need him where he is." Where he is. Not because I wasn't capable, but because my current position served them better than my potential ever could. That was the moment the role crystallized for me. I wasn't being developed. I was being preserved. Preserved in a position that maximized output and minimized disruption. Preserved as a solution, not a successor. Preserved because I made other people's jobs easier. I went back to my desk and did exactly what I'd been doing before. Not because I agreed with it, but because at that point, I didn't yet know what the alternative looked like. I just knew something important. As long as I continued to play this role without question, no one else would ever question it either. And once a role becomes convenient, it becomes invisible. The day things shifted didn't come with an argument or a revelation. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment that would stand out to anyone else. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I remember that because nothing about the day itself demanded attention. Same commute, same building, same quiet hum of fluorescent lights that made every morning feel interchangeable. I had my annual performance review scheduled that afternoon. I wasn't anxious. I already knew how it would go. I'd delivered on every objective. Metrics were strong. Stakeholder feedback was positive. I'd even taken on responsibilities that weren't officially mine. Again, when I sat down across from my manager, he smiled in that practiced way that signals reassurance. "Overall," he said, scrolling through the document on his screen, "your performance this year was excellent." Excellent! The word landed softly. Familiar. Safe. He went through the highlights. My adaptability, my work ethic, my reliability, the way I could be counted on in critical moments. He thanked me for my commitment during a particularly demanding quarter, the one where I'd averaged close to 70 hours a week. Then he paused. "For the promotion," he said, "we've decided to go in a different direction." The explanation came quickly and smoothly. Organizational fit, long-term vision, leadership alignment. Phrases designed to sound thoughtful without revealing anything. I listened. I nodded. I didn't interrupt. At one point, he added, almost as an afterthought, "This was a tough decision, but it was already agreed on at a higher level." Already agreed on. That was it. No feedback to integrate, no gap to close, no future pathway outlined, just confirmation that the outcome had been set before my performance was ever evaluated. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not disappointment, clarity. For the first time, I saw the situation without the stories I'd been telling myself. This wasn't about timing or readiness or needing to prove myself one more cycle. This was about placement. I thanked him for the feedback. I meant it. He looked relieved, as if he'd been bracing for a reaction that never came. Back at my desk, I opened my notebook. I didn't vent. I didn't write questions. I wrote facts. Review, excellent. Promotion, denied. Decision pre-made. 3 lines. Clean, undeniable, and something inside me clicked into place. Not resentment, resolution. I realized that everything I'd been doing, staying late, smoothing over issues, absorbing responsibility, wasn't moving me forward. It was reinforcing the very role that made me easy to pass over. I wasn't being evaluated for growth. I was being maintained for stability. The shift wasn't emotional. It was strategic. For the rest of the day, nothing changed on the surface. I answered emails. I joined calls. I solved problems. But internally, I stopped waiting. I stopped assuming effort would translate into opportunity if I just gave it more time. That afternoon didn't make me louder. It didn't make me confrontational. It made me precise. Because once you accept that the system isn't designed to reward you, you have 2 choices. Keep feeding it or step back and decide how much access it really deserves. I chose to start deciding. Quietly. After that day, my silence changed character. Before, it had been instinctive, polite, conditioned. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to seem difficult, because I believed restraint would eventually be rewarded. Now, I stayed quiet on purpose. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still showed up on time, still delivered clean work, still responded quickly. If anything, I became easier to manage. No questions about growth, No follow-ups about the promotion, no visible disappointment. People mistook that calm for acceptance. What they didn't see was that I had stopped volunteering pieces of myself that had previously been free. I no longer fill in gaps before being asked. I no longer preemptively solved problems that weren't explicitly mine. I executed exactly what was requested. No more, no less, more, no less. Not out of spite, out of accuracy. I noticed how often ambiguity had relied on my initiative to become clarity. When I stopped smoothing things over automatically, small delays appeared. Questions went unanswered longer than usual. Meetings ended with loose ends. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. And still, no one connected it to me. They assumed things were busy. That complexity had increased. Those processes needed refinement. I let them assume. In meetings, I spoke less. But when I did speak, it was deliberate. I stopped offering speculative ideas and focused on verifiable facts. If something wasn't feasible, I said so plainly without cushioning it in optimism. People began to nod more slowly. Some mistook this for withdrawal, others for compliance. A few saw it as fatigue. No one saw it as a decision. At the same time, I began to observe more carefully. Who asked for what? Who made decisions versus who executed them? Where accountability actually lived when outcomes were poor. I kept writing things down, not emotions, patterns. I noticed how often my name appeared in operational dependencies without any corresponding authority. How frequently projects assumed my availability without confirmation. How much institutional knowledge sat with me alone, undocumented elsewhere. This wasn't ego, it was inventory. And the more I inventoried, the clearer it became. My silence had been subsidizing inefficiency. By choosing not to fill every gap, I wasn't being unhelpful. I was being accurate. I was allowing the system to reflect its true shape without my constant compensation. A colleague asked me once, half joking, "You okay? You've been quieter than usual." I smiled. Just focused. That was true. Focused on understanding where my effort actually went and who benefited from it. I didn't correct misconceptions. If someone underestimated my involvement, I let them. If someone assumed a process was simple because it had always worked, I let them keep believing that, too. Silence, I learned, is unsettling when people are used to you carrying invisible weight. But it's also revealing, because when you stop explaining yourself, others start explaining their expectations, often without realizing it. And expectations, once visible, can be measured. I wasn't withdrawing. I was repositioning. I hadn't changed my values. I'd changed my boundaries. And for the first time, silence wasn't something that happened to me. It was something I was using. While things looked quieter on the surface, my attention sharpened. What they never noticed was how much of the organization's memory lived in places no one thought to look. Not in shared drives, not in official documentation, in conversations, in decisions made during outages, in exceptions quietly approved to keep things moving. And a disproportionate amount of that lived with me. For years, I'd been the connective tissue. When systems didn't talk to each other, I translated. When departments misunderstood constraints, I reframed. When leadership wanted certainty without delay, I gave them answers fast enough that they never asked how fragile those answers actually were. I started mapping that reality, not formally, not in a way anyone else could see. I cataloged processes that depended on informal knowledge. I traced workflows back to their real decision points, not the ones shown on org charts. I noted which approvals were ceremonial and which ones actually mattered when something broke. This wasn't sabotage, it was understanding. I documented my own contributions in ways I never had before, not for recognition, but for clarity. I wrote down what happened when I wasn't involved early, how timelines slipped, how assumptions collapsed, how people scrambled to recreate context they didn't realize they'd outsourced to me. No one accused me of withholding, because I wasn't. I was still responsive, still professional, still helpful when asked. The difference was that I stopped anticipating needs that no one acknowledged. I also started learning quietly. Not new technical skills. I already had plenty. I learned how decisions actually moved. Who influenced whom? Which narratives did leadership respond to, and which data points quietly changed outcomes? I watched how visibility was manufactured, how confidence filled gaps where substance should have been, how people spoke about work versus how work was actually done. And I noticed something else. The people being positioned for advancement were being protected from complexity, while I absorbed it. They presented clean stories because someone else, often me, had already dealt with the mess. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me careful. I began positioning my work differently, not louder, clearer. I stopped rescuing weak plans in private and instead surfaced constraints earlier, in neutral language, on record. If something wasn't feasible, I said so without offering a workaround unless one was explicitly requested. If a risk existed, I documented it once and let it stand. I let leadership own their decisions fully. What surprised me was how quickly people adapted to my new boundaries, not to the problems. They still assumed I'd be there, still leaned on my presence, still underestimated how much was being held together by habit rather than structure. They didn't notice the notebook. They didn't notice the shift in how I responded. They didn't notice that I was no longer smoothing outcomes, only executing instructions. Because from their perspective, Matthew was still fine. What they missed was that I was no longer investing in invisibility. I was investing in optionality. And optionality, once built, doesn't announce itself. It waits. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no single document, no hidden email, no sudden realization that unlocked everything at once. It came the way clarity usually does, incrementally, then all at once in retrospect. I was reviewing a routine request late one evening, a minor process adjustment tied to a system no one thought much about because it had always worked. The request assumed a level of simplicity that didn't exist, and as I traced the workflow end to end, something became obvious. I was the only consistent point of continuity, not by design, by erosion. Over the years, people had moved on, roles had shifted, documentation had decayed. What remained was a structure that looked stable because I had been stabilizing it quietly. I sat back and thought through the recent months. Every quick question is routed to me. Every escalation that skipped formal channels. Every time someone said, "Matthew will know." It wasn't just knowledge. It was judgment, context, history. The reasoning behind exceptions that had never been written down because writing them down would have slowed things, and I'd been rewarded for speed. The private reveal was this: my leverage wasn't positional, it was structural, and more importantly, it was unintentional. I hadn't been building it to protect myself. I'd built it to be useful. That distinction mattered, because leverage built unconsciously is fragile. Leverage understood is not. I spent the next few weeks confirming what I already suspected, quietly, carefully. I asked neutral questions and listened to the answers. I noticed how often people deferred decisions until I weighed in, even when I wasn't in the room. I paid attention to how frequently timelines depended on my quick check or my final review. No one thought this was risky. Why would they? I had never given them a reason to, and I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel powerful. I felt clear. Clear that the system didn't know how much it relied on me. Clear that my role had grown critical without ever becoming visible. Clear that my value had been fully extracted without any obligation to return it. That was the moment I stopped thinking in terms of fairness. Not because fairness didn't matter, but because it wasn't the operating principle in play. The operating principle was convenience, and convenience only respects boundaries when they're enforced. I didn't rush. I didn't act on impulse. I didn't confront anyone with what I'd realized. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it. The reveal wasn't that I had leverage. It was then that I finally understood what kind it was, and what it would require to keep it from being taken for granted again. No celebration, no anger, just clarity and a narrowing of options. Because once you see where your real value sits, you can't unsee it. And you can't go back to pretending it doesn't matter. Once the clarity settled, I didn't feel urgency. That surprised me. You'd expect a moment like that. The realization of leverage, of quiet centrality to trigger action. A demand. A negotiation. At least a plan with dates and milestones. Instead, what followed was stillness. Because the decision point wasn't about what I could do. It was about who I was willing to be from that moment forward. For the first time, I stopped framing my situation as a misunderstanding that needed correction. I stopped imagining a future conversation where someone finally got it and fixed things. That fantasy dissolved on its own. What replaced it was a more uncomfortable truth. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. It rewarded visibility, not depth. Confidence, not continuity. It preserved stability, not fairness, and I had been an ideal component, absorbing friction, reducing risk, requiring nothing in return. The question wasn't how to make them see me. The question was whether I was willing to continue making it easy for them not to. I listed my options, not in a dramatic way, just methodically. Option 1, stay. Keep doing what I was doing. Maybe ask next cycle. Maybe hope leadership changed. Maybe wait for timing to align. It was the safest option emotionally, because it required no rupture. But staying meant accepting something I hadn't before. That excellence alone would never alter my trajectory here. It meant choosing comfort over alignment. It meant slowly resenting a place that had no incentive to change how it treated me. I crossed it off. Option 2, confront. Schedule a meeting. Lay out the facts. Explain the dependency. Ask for role clarity, authority, compensation, and advancement. It sounded reasonable, professional, mature. But I knew how that story ended. Best case, they'd thank me for my honesty and offer incremental concessions. More responsibility, maybe a title adjustment, a vague promise of next time. Enough to keep me engaged, not enough to disrupt the structure that benefited them. Worst case, I'd be labeled difficult, or transactional, or no longer the Matthew we know. And even if they agreed to everything, the power dynamic would remain intact. They'd know I wanted something. They'd know where to apply pressure. I didn't want to negotiate my worth with people who had already demonstrated how they valued silence. I crossed that off too. Option 3, disengage emotionally, stay operationally. Do the job, collect the paycheck, build a life elsewhere, treat work as a transaction. Plenty of people do this, successfully. But I knew myself well enough to know that disengagement would curdle into bitterness. I'd start cutting corners, not in quality, but in care. And care was part of my integrity. I didn't want to become smaller to fit a system that had already narrowed me. That left option 4, the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider until now. Leave. Not dramatically, not angrily, not in a blaze of exposure. Leave in a way that respected my values and acknowledged reality. This was the irreversible option. Once I chose it, everything else aligned quickly. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. I didn't tell anyone, not even close colleagues. I didn't update my resume publicly. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I started preparing in silence. I reviewed my employment agreement carefully. No shortcuts. I noted notice periods, non-compete language, and confidentiality clauses. I made sure I understood exactly what I owed and what I didn't. I documented processes thoroughly, not for them, but for myself, to ensure that if I left, I could do so cleanly, without guilt or ethical gray areas. I also began exploring the market, not impulsively, but strategically. I wasn't looking for escape. I was looking for alignment. Roles where depth was valued, where institutional knowledge was respected, where authority matched responsibility. The interviews felt different from what I expected. When I spoke openly about the complexity I'd handled, without minimizing it, without overselling it, people listened, asked follow-ups, wanted specifics. For the first time in a long while, my experience wasn't being translated by someone else. It stood on its own. Still, I didn't rush, because leaving wasn't just a career move. It was a statement, to myself more than anyone else. It said, I will not subsidize a system that depends on my silence. I will not confuse loyalty with self-erasure. I will not wait to be chosen by people who benefit from not choosing me. The hardest part wasn't fear. It was letting go of the version of myself that believed endurance was enough. There was grief in that. Quiet grief. Grief for the hours I'd given freely, for the trust I'd placed in fairness, for the identity I'd built around being indispensable but unseen. But grief clarified rather than weakened me. Because once you accept that something is over, even before it formally ends, you stop negotiating with the past. You start preparing for the future. I set a private timeline, not aggressive, not passive, just inevitable. From that moment on, every action I took was aligned with one truth. I was already leaving. They just didn't know it yet. And because they didn't know, nothing changed, on the surface, which made what came next possible. Once the decision was made, I became very careful about pace. Not slow, measured. There's a difference. People assume that when someone decides to leave, everything accelerates. Resumes flying out, interviews stacked, impatience leaking into behavior. That wasn't what happened with me. What happened instead was compression. Every unnecessary movement stopped. Every action had intent. At work, I became almost invisible in a new way. Not disengaged, precise. I met deadlines exactly. I communicated clearly, but only within scope. I stopped adding just-in-case insights. Stopped fixing things before they were officially broken. I let processes reveal themselves. And quietly they did. Small inefficiencies surfaced. Minor dependencies became noticeable. People began asking more follow-up questions, not because anything was wrong, but because things no longer resolved themselves automatically. Still, no alarms. From the outside, I looked like the same dependable employee. Calm, focused, cooperative. Inside, everything I did had a clock attached to it. I started unwinding my centrality ethically. This part mattered to me. I didn't want to leave chaos behind, not out of obligation to the company, but out of respect for my own standards. I documented systems thoroughly, not just how they worked, but why decisions had been made a certain way. I created guides that someone competent could follow, but only if they invested the time. I stopped being the shortcut. At the same time, I made sure no new shortcuts were built around me. When asked questions that required deep context, I answered them. But I also pointed to the documentation. Gently. Repeatedly. I encouraged others to take ownership. Most didn't. Not because they couldn't, but because they weren't used to needing to. Outside of work, my preparation was just as quiet. I didn't announce anything to my network. I reached out selectively, thoughtfully. Conversations, not applications. I asked questions instead of pitching myself. What does success look like here after 1 year? Where does decision-making actually sit? How does the organization handle people who know too much to be easily replaced? The answers told me more than job descriptions ever could. I turned down roles that felt familiar in the wrong way. Places where they wanted a stabilizer, a safe pair of hands. I recognize the language now. I wasn't interested in being preserved again. What struck me during this period was how little resistance I felt internally. No panic, no second guessing. That's how I knew the decision was right. At work, no one checked in about my future. No one revisited the promotion conversation. No one sensed anything. Why would they? From their perspective, I was still performing, still quiet, still dependable. They didn't see the invisible boundary I'd drawn. They didn't know that every undocumented exception now had an expiration date, that every dependency on my memory was being gently transferred or left exposed. I wasn't pulling away. I was decoupling. There's a moment when you're moving in silence where you realize something unsettling and empowering at the same time. You were never being watched as closely as you thought. As long as outputs continued, no one questioned inputs. As long as things worked, no one traced how. My presence had always been assumed, not monitored. That assumption gave me space. Space to prepare without interference. Space to exit without drama. Space to ensure that when I left, the system would have to confront its own design. Not through collapse, through adjustment. An adjustment is uncomfortable when you've grown used to someone else absorbing the discomfort for you. I finalized my timeline. Still flexible, still quiet, but no longer theoretical. From that point on, I was no longer planning to leave. I was executing a departure that respected my ethics and acknowledged reality. Every day after that was borrowed time. They just didn't know it. The first consequences didn't arrive with chaos. They arrived in confusion. Not the loud kind, no escalations, no emergency meetings, but the subtle kind that shows up as hesitation, delays, follow-up emails that ask the same question in slightly different ways. It started small. A project that usually moved smoothly began stalling between steps. Not because anyone was incompetent, but because no one quite knew who was responsible for the handoff anymore. The assumptions that were used to bridge those gaps were gone. People noticed the friction, but they didn't name it. This process feels heavier than usual, someone said on a call. Another replied, yeah, maybe we need to tighten documentation. They were close, but not close enough. I kept working. I answered what I was asked. I pointed people to the resources I'd created. I stayed professional. But I didn't step in reflexively. That was the difference. Soon, questions started coming to me later than they used to, after decisions had already been made, after commitments were announced. And when I pointed out constraints, the tone shifted from casual to concerned. Wait, why wasn't this flagged earlier? I looked at the timeline, the emails, the invites. It wasn't discussed, I said calmly. I wasn't included. There was a pause. No apology, just a recalibration. The impact wasn't immediate, but it was cumulative. Managers began staying on calls longer. Meetings multiplied. People who were used to clean answers started circling the same issues, trying to reconstruct the context that used to arrive fully formed. I could feel the organization working harder to achieve the same results. Still, no one confronted me, because from their perspective, I hadn't changed. I hadn't missed deadlines. I hadn't refused work. I hadn't complained. I had simply stopped being the invisible glue, and glue is only noticed when it dries out. I overheard someone say, we should probably run this by Matthew, just to be safe. Another replied, yeah, but can you ask him? I don't want to bother him if he's busy. Busy. That word came up a lot, as if my availability had always been a given, and now it felt uncertain. Not because I'd withdrawn, but because people had to ask. That was new. I noticed leadership growing more cautious, less decisive. They asked for more confirmations, more sign-offs. The confidence that used to carry them through ambiguous decisions was being replaced by process, and the process is slower than instinct. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt distance, because I knew what was coming, and they didn't. The system was beginning to experience the cost of its own design, not as punishment, but as feedback. And feedback, when ignored for too long, always arrives eventually. This was just the beginning. By the time concern turned into urgency, the shape of the problem was already fixed. It showed up first as meetings that shouldn't have existed, long ones, overcrowded ones, the kind where everyone is present because no one is certain who actually owns the decision. People were trying to solve coordination issues with attendance. That never works. I watched managers revisit decisions they'd already announced, not because the decisions were wrong, but because execution kept surfacing questions they couldn't answer confidently anymore. What's the precedent here? Have we handled this before? Why does this feel harder than it used to? The questions floated around the room. They used to land on me. Now, they just hung there. I answered when directly asked, always calmly, always factually, but without stepping into the role I'd once occupied by default. It made the absence more visible. At some point, someone suggested, maybe we should formalize this, create a dedicated role. The room went quiet. Titles had a way of appearing only after dependency became uncomfortable. Suddenly, conversations about resourcing surfaced, about succession planning, about single points of failure. I had been one for years. Now it was a risk. What struck me was how quickly the narrative shifted. The same behaviors that had once been framed as reliability were now being reframed as overconcentration. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because the cost of ignoring it had finally arrived. I was asked to join a meeting with senior leadership. It wasn't confrontational. It was exploratory. They asked thoughtful questions, probing ones, about workflows, about knowledge transfer, about what I thought the organization needed long-term. I answered honestly, but I didn't volunteer solutions beyond my scope. They were trying to fix a system without acknowledging the reason it had needed fixing, and I understood why. Admitting the real issue would require admitting that my stagnation hadn't been accidental. That was a harder conversation than any operational inefficiency. Offers began to surface, not formally, not cleanly. Hints of future opportunities, mentions of revisiting roles, a suggestion that we map out a path. It was all happening very quickly. Too quickly, because what they were responding to wasn't my potential. It was my absence. And absence doesn't rebuild trust. It exposes dependency. I listened. I nodded. I thanked them for the confidence. I didn't commit. They were trying to fix something that had taken years to create, on a timeline dictated by discomfort, not reflection. That rarely works. Internally, I felt no triumph, no vindication, just confirmation. They didn't see me when I was present. They noticed me when I stopped compensating. By then, my timeline was already in motion, and nothing they offered addressed the core issue, the role I'd been preserved in, and the system that had benefited from my silence. Fixing it would require a redesign. What they wanted was relief, and relief is temporary. By the time they realized that, it was already too late to fix it. The conversation everyone expects in stories like this, the emotional one, the charged one, never really happened. What did happen was quieter, shorter, and far more revealing. My manager asked if we could talk. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed. We sat in a small conference room with glass walls, the kind designed to signal transparency while still containing difficult conversations. He didn't waste time. "I've been hearing your name come up a lot lately," he said, in a different way. I nodded. He explained that leadership was concerned about dependencies, about risk, about how much institutional knowledge sat with one person. He framed it as a compliment. Again, I let him finish. Then I said evenly, "This isn't new?" That was it. No accusation, no list of grievances, just a fact. He looked surprised, not defensive, confused. I continued, "I've been operating this way for years. The difference is that I'm no longer filling gaps that aren't formally owned." Silence. He asked why I hadn't raised concerns earlier. I told him the truth. I did, indirectly, and when nothing changed, I adjusted my expectations. That landed harder than anything emotional could have. He asked what I wanted. I paused, not for effect, but because the answer deserved precision. "I want alignment," I said, "between responsibility, authority, and growth. I also want clarity about whether that's actually possible here." There was no defensiveness in my voice, no edge, just calibration. He spoke about timelines, about processes, about how things could evolve. I listened. Then I said, "I'm not interested in future maybes." Another pause. I could see him recalculating, not my value, but the cost of losing me. And for the first time, I felt no urge to soften the moment. I wasn't asking for reassurance. I wasn't negotiating. I was stating where I stood. The meeting ended politely, respectfully. Nothing was resolved, but something was understood. On my way back to my desk, I felt lighter. Not because I'd won anything, but because I'd finally spoken without needing the outcome to validate me. There was no heat in that confrontation, just clarity. And clarity, once expressed, doesn't need repetition. By the time my departure became official, it felt almost anticlimactic. No grand announcement, no sudden shift in tone, Just a calendar invite, a formal notice, and a quiet recalibration of how people interacted with me once they realized the timeline was real. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not relieved, not triumphant, grounded. For the first time in years, my internal sense of self wasn't being negotiated against someone else's expectations. I wasn't the reliable one anymore. Not because I'd failed at it, but because I'd outgrown the version of myself that accepted reliability as a ceiling. In my final weeks, people were kinder, more attentive. They asked thoughtful questions. Some even admitted they hadn't realized how much I handled. I didn't correct them. Awareness that arrives late doesn't need commentary. I transitioned my responsibilities cleanly, documented everything I ethically could, answered questions honestly without bitterness or withholding, not because the organization deserved it, but because I did. Integrity, I learned, isn't about how others treat you. It's about how you choose to act once you see clearly. The role I stepped into next was quieter than people might expect. Smaller team, fewer layers, clear ownership, authority that matched responsibility. No pedestal, no spotlight. But when I spoke, it carried weight because it was expected to. And for the first time, silence was optional, not imposed. I noticed the difference immediately. Decisions were discussed, not announced. Context was shared, not assumed. When something depended on me, it was explicit and balanced by trust and autonomy. I didn't need to prove myself through exhaustion anymore. I didn't need to earn visibility by overextension. I was valued for judgment, not just output. Looking back, I don't regret the years I spent being invisible. They taught me how systems really work, how quiet people are often the ones holding things together, how easily consistency is mistaken for consent. But I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. Who I am now isn't louder, or harder, or more guarded. I'm clearer, clear about my boundaries, clear about my value, clear about the difference between being needed and being respected. And perhaps most importantly, clear that growth doesn't come from waiting to be chosen. It comes from choosing yourself, even when no one is watching. There's a temptation, at the end of a story like this, to look for a villain, a single person, a name, someone whose intentions were clearly bad, whose actions were easy to condemn. That would make everything simpler, cleaner, easier to resolve. But that wasn't my experience. What I ran into wasn't cruelty, it was convenience. A system that rewarded what it could see and leaned heavily on what it didn't need to understand. People who weren't malicious, just comfortable. Decisions that weren't personal, just efficient. And I played my part in that longer than I should have. I equated being useful with being valued. I thought consistency would eventually be noticed. I believed silence made me easier to trust. What I didn't realize was that silence also makes you easy to assign. The moral of this story isn't work less or trust no one. It's not even leave when you're overlooked, because not every situation requires departure. The real lesson is quieter than that. If your effort consistently outpaces your authority, something is misaligned. If your work is praised, but your trajectory never changes, something is already decided. And if you're always the one absorbing discomfort so others don't have to feel it, the system will gladly let you keep doing that forever. Clarity doesn't always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it arrives with stillness, with the moment you stop compensating and start observing. Quiet dominance isn't about winning loudly. It's about refusing to subsidize what no longer serves you. Leaving wasn't revenge. It wasn't a statement to them. It was a commitment to myself. A commitment to place my effort where it could actually grow into something sustainable. To choose environments that didn't require invisibility as a prerequisite for trust. To understand that being needed and being respected are not the same thing. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you've been told you're excellent while staying exactly where you are, I'd encourage you not to rush to conclusions. Just start paying attention. Notice where your silence is being interpreted as agreement. Notice where your reliability has become an expectation instead of a strength. Notice whether the future you're waiting for actually has room for you in it. And then decide, quietly, honestly, what you're willing to keep giving. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever realized that a decision about your role had already been made, long before anyone told you?